there is a sort of mediocrity pact that we all do. As in, we keep undercutting caveats, we keep actually going straight to the point that we want to make without adding those caveats. And because networks are segregated, we keep delineating less and less caveats just for energy preservation, let's call it. But then, parallel to all that, there is a separate network of people that are like-minded themselves who are doing the exact same thing, but with a different point. And every once in a while, we meet people across networks. And that's where we see each other. Whoa, I disagree with this point.
That person must be a jerk. That person must be a jerk. How can you find a way to work together when you don't have a consensus? What happens if, like, we don't agree on everything? Clearly, we can't agree on everything in some sense, right? Okay, we're still going to have to figure out a way to work together.
To find whether something is true or not is often much easier than to find whether something is important or not. Because if you think about the notion of what is important and what is not important, that becomes more subjective. Then you are necessarily restricting yourself to what we call objective truth, because it has to be a certain kind of truth that scales across different instruments of observation. Otherwise, it cannot be falsifiable. Otherwise, it cannot be replicable. There was a moment where you were the only one person, or you and your co-authors were the only people that knew that idea.
Yeah.
And now you're trying to convey to people that idea.
Yeah.
That gap between your information set and everyone's information set, that gap right there is going to be first perceived as a subjective experience.
Well, it's funny you're talking about trying to be thoughtful and trying to be nuanced. And we talked about this a little bit the last time, how any ideology, there's kind of this range over which I think it will apply and some range over which it probably doesn't. And I think it reminds me when I was, I don't know, maybe 18. I think I had this view that if you were an adult and you didn't have like some strong ideology, whether it was capitalist or communist or socialist, whatever, if you didn't have some strong like worldview, some strong ideology, you hadn't thought about the world. And then, at some point now, I think the exact opposite. It's kind of like if you just have one strict worldview, I mean, there's principles, right? Like, I think it's good to have principles. And obviously, I think, there's certain things you could call me or probably call you, but I think the bigger issue of like, once you start seeing how much nuance there is in the world and in life, I think that's something that once you see it, it's really hard to just kind of plow forward with just kind of simple take on things.
Yeah. Last time we talked about how sometimes developing social norms so that epistemic humility is more likely to emerge. Those things actually are very helpful. And this is actually part of the reason why I wanted to have conversations like the one I'm having with you, right? Because how do we learn like as kids and in situations like that? We usually learn by seeing other people doing things, right? And I find that right now, the opportunities for people to learn how conversations happen, they are not representative of reality. It's definitely not representative of how nuanced conversations emerge. Conversations like the ones we last had, where there's a lot of ums and ahs and pauses and things like that. This is exactly how people think as they are speaking, right? And they want to add caveats and they want to anticipate disagreements so that we can actually provide more precise statements. And if I was fully certain of what I was going to say, it would sound very round and very nice, but most likely it will be unrepresentative about my understanding of the world. Perhaps not unrepresentative about my current understanding of the world, but certainly unrepresentative about my degree of certainty, right? About how certain I am that I'm correct. And I find that this is lacking in the world. We need more conversations that represent how often nuance shows up. And I think we have an opportunity here in this channel to do these kinds of stuff. However, it's also important to understand that, and this goes back to the previous conversation we had, cognitive dissonance is unfortunately something that is painful. And we all do not want to be there. We don't want to be there standing with cognitive dissonance. I would love to already know the answer to my question. I would love to know even questions like, does God exist? I would love to know those things. But I have to be there in the middle, actually putting weights to different possibilities. And that is often very unsatisfying to me. But for me, at least, that's part of the job of trying to be intellectually honest, is to develop the tools to be okay with that cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, I mean, I think it can be uncomfortable, and I think it can be also like a little bit like unsettling, right? It's a little bit, I don't know, even like disorienting, right? Like when you, especially when it's something that, there's things that you have believed for a while, or you've built certain, thought processes or habits in your life around, and then you realize like, oh, that could actually be wrong. Like uh, I think that really, I think that's unsettling. I think that's very unsettling. But I mean, I guess so. Here's a question for you. I mean, when you look at the public discourse right now, how much do you think of what's going on and the lack of this kind of nuanced conversation is about kind of the news, like new media types, and how much of it is about the news landscape and how much of it is about, what do you think the main culprits are? Because I think there's already these like kind of bigger, broader, kind of instincts we have that are pushing us in certain ways, that ideally we could have, say, institutions or, like you said, social norms that maybe push us towards more constructive conversations. And I guess the question is, what do you think is pushing us right now toward less constructive conversations?
I think the most obvious culprit here is the business model of all those companies. Most of the business model tends to be to not charge the consumer directly, but charge, say, advertisers. And of course, then the KPI, right? The you become the product, right? Essentially, the company's bottom line is to maximize your attention as much as possible, because that's usually how you will drive the willingness to pay of the advertisers. The concern there is that for you to be enticed to watch something, they can go straight to your amygdala, right? They don't need to talk to your system 2 at all. They can go straight to your system 1.
Yeah.
They talk about things that really affects us. We are all compliers to that. Like talking about things that generate fear, dopamine hits and all that. And we go straight there. And of course, as we discussed last time, one thing I'm concerned is that this is not sustainable, right? Now, as we know, being economists that we are, like, when we find that something is not sustainable, that does not mean that the way to affect as a policymaker is exactly the first thing we think about, which is, let's all change the business model of companies and things like that. Because this goes back to epistemic immediately, right? Chances are we have no idea what is the original culprit. And something that comes even upstream from that is actually the original culprit. So we need to think through this, because chances are it's not a business model per se, it's something else.
So, I mean, in some sense, but also don't you feel, I mean, when you say that, I think of, I don't know, I think of this as like a very old, maybe kind of debate. I'm thinking of the Platonic dialogue Gorgias. I don't know if you've ever read that one.
No.
But it's kind of discussion between philosophy and sophistry. And so there's just kind of this whole back and forth, and it kind of really gets at, philosophy being about asking questions and trying to really understand things the way they are, and sophistry being about trying to manipulate maybe people's opinions to get kind of whatever you want, or to get people to go along with you. So yeah, I think this is like a really old issue, right? Of like this kind of debate, or this kind of competition between these approaches to the world, of like trying to shape people's perceptions based off of trying to convince a crowd of people or something to go along with something, versus trying to understand for yourself and for each other, trying to help each other understand. And I just feel like maybe it's harder to use the tools for philosophy than sophistry, but maybe that's wrong. Maybe we just have to figure out how to use the tools for philosophy.
I think part of the problem here too is the classic coordination problem, but not in the way most people think about coordination problem, which are very important issues. So I actually had a video about this. So every time you go and speak to me about something, right? You and I are like-minded. That's in part why we became friends. We have different but similar points of views in most things, right? That's why we segregate, and here we are talking. But then you go about and you say something, right? Let's say that you make a point. First of all, I'm the one hearing it. So
Yes.
you will not necessarily add some caveats because you find those caveats to be irrelevant. Because you and I agree about that. It is your expectation that I agree with you, right?
Yeah.
Now, I will hear your point, and as part of the points that I just heard, it will not be that caveat you forgot to add or you decided not to add. It will not be part. So next time I go and talk to another person, and I try to essentially regurgitate your point and perhaps make a different point for me and so on, right? Now, I will not necessarily add the caveats that you were to add, but you did not add, right? That is a key point here, because just because of energy preservation and also redundancy, my guess is that there is a sort of like mediocrity pact that we all do. As in, we keep undercutting caveats, we keep actually going straight to the point that we want to make without adding those caveats. And because networks are segregated, we keep doing this, and we keep delineating less and less caveats just for energy preservation, let's call it. But then parallel to all that, there is a separate network of people that are like-minded themselves who are doing the exact same thing, but with a different point.
Yeah.
And then every once in a while, you and I go and meet somebody from that network. And again, after a while, our network will come up with an opinion that is very stripped down from caveats. And they come up with an idea that is very stripped down from caveats. And more than that, right? Each of us not only come up with those ideas, but we have received a lot of evidence that we must be right. After all, every time I talk to Dionissi about this point, he seems to want to. Right? I must be a genius after all. I must be a genius. Every time I talk to my group of people, everybody agrees with me. And they are doing the same. They all be thinking they must be genius and so on, right? Now, after a while, when we talk to each other, we don't get a representative version from the other side and vice versa. We get the most stripped down, no nuance perspective from the other side. And you know how it gets worse is that nuance is just one dimension of what I call in previous videos like the idea package, right? So whenever you're making a point, it's not only the content, right? It's who is speaking, whether that person who is speaking has accent, all these things. Like this will develop or not develop trust about what they have to say. I mean, imagine if I was speaking exactly what I'm speaking right now with a British accent. I can guarantee you'll believe me more. Right? So you know what I mean? Like, for instance, even the way I'm moving my arms right now, right? This can resonate with some people, maybe Latinos, but maybe I will be seen as more like rough on my edges in the way I'm speaking. You know what I mean? It happens all the time with our energy and how abrasive we may sound or may look to
Yeah.
people. All this is a whole, again, vector of all different things that we are evaluating at the moment.
Yeah.
And we're going to evaluate whether we trust an idea or not based on all those things. My guess is that all those things are getting delineated when I go from one iteration to another iteration within my network. For instance, right now, let's say I'm saying some point and I see a nod from you. Next time, when I make the exact same point to another person, I will make this point with a tone a little bit more certain than the time I made the point with you. So all this gets delineated, and over time, there's this mediocrity pact within networks where people
Not
are
pushing
making
each other.
statements more certain of themselves, less caveats, all those things. And every once in a while, we meet people across networks, and that's when we see each other. Whoa, I disagree with this point. This is
That person
crazy.
must be a jerk. That person must be a jerk.
I do not know a solution to how we can handle this problem, but I think just the awareness that this not only happens, but this happens in a exponential way, right? Because when I talk to you, I speak to the next person, I speak to the next person, and the other person keeps speaking to the next person based on my ideas and so on. This is actually going exponentially, and we don't see every iteration. We see, like, if we go from 1 month to the next month, maybe 100 iterations like that have happened within the month. So that is my concern in general. I think we need to have more awareness about how, first of all, how true this point is, and also how much we underestimate the effect of this point, so that when we hear other people's perspectives, it's not really quite what they mean, but rather this is the outcome of a lot of stripping down nuance from inside their own network.
Okay, so obviously a lot of what you just said resonates with me, but I guess I'm not allowed to say that because it's gonna make us converge towards the hive mind. No, but I almost feel like breaking this apart into two parts, and I think it comes back to this thing of like interested versus disinterested reasoning. And I think about it the following way. Heraclitus said essentially that the laws of a city should be defended like its walls, right? And I think that's a little bit like beliefs, right? So it's like, when should you update your beliefs or when should you change them? On the one hand, I think it's like, if you can almost take this kind of Buddhist perspective or just like be totally disinterested in the world, it's kind of like, well, I don't know. I'm just going to go around and I don't have to advocate for any positions. I'm just going to see and think. I'm going to try not to judge. But I don't know the right way of saying it. I almost feel like there's like a luxury or a privilege to that kind of disinterest, in the sense of, what if I'm interested because, like, I've got to eat, I've got to, I've got to get the promotion, or I've got to, if I have some objectives or if I do have some interests, some of those might not be like selfish or greedy. It might just be self-interest in a like self-preservation kind of way, right? And so I think that tension to me feels like a big part of the issue. Like, as I'm getting older, I'm trying to be more disinterested and slower to judge, because I mean, even I can remember situations with like co-authors, right? Where, and this goes in both directions. I'll say it one direction, but it definitely has gone in both directions, where like, I would say an idea and a co-author would say, oh, that's crazy. That can't be true. And then you start arguing with each other, you start going back and forth, and you realize like, what they're saying is actually making sense. Like, oh man, I can't believe I totally wrote that off, right? But I guess the question is, is when are the moments that you think about your beliefs, should you kind of guard them and hold on to them? Because look, everybody's got an opinion. Everybody's going to come and tell you what they think. And like you were saying before, right? Some of this is just a matter of like efficiency, right? Like preservation of energy. Like, I can't hear everybody's ideas, right? I have to have some kind of filter for them. But on the other hand, I have to be open and I have to realize, how do you have a good self-correction mechanism? Like, what's involved there?
I usually don't like even thinking about prescriptive suggestions, right? Just because, as you know, all those things I'm saying, most of the time I'm not behaving like that, right? This is not, this is the very best version of myself in my most mindful self. This is not my average self, right? My average self has a lot of system one, does reactive and things like that, right? So, and of course, I really don't believe in creating policies that require willpower, right? So, I mean, that's why we think so much about developing incentives and creating systems that actually mitigate the problems that we're talking about and actually increase the impact of whoever is doing, or at least in the moment, they are doing more nuanced conversations. So I think this eventually will have to take us to understanding what will be the optimal algorithm in a place like Twitter or Facebook or TikTok or YouTube. What will be the optimal algorithm where nuance emerges? And we can have a conversation about that. In fact, I wanted to talk to you also about a paper I want to write about that. For now, let's just talk about the fact that part of the issue is that we gain a lot of private benefits out of actually nodding along. Like, for instance, you say something that I kind of believe, but even when you are telling me things, I kind of believe, but I see some necessary caveats that I would have to add because you were saying perhaps with a tone that is a little bit more
strong,
a little stronger than I believe. But I also know who you are. I also know what you think. I can see that, no, I'm not going to dispute, oh, by the way, let's add this caveat. Because think about the decision of telling you right now, oh, Dionissi, I think this additional caveat is necessary. For me to say that to you, it will be seen by you as some form of pushback. So, people do lose a little bit of whatever, brownie points or some
capital.
notion
It's some
of
capital.
social capital with your friend about that. I lose something about that. And what is there for me to gain? This appears to be completely irrelevant. After all, Dionissi agrees with me.
Well, and it's just going to get frustrating if every nuance, if we add a little bit of nuance to every comment that each other makes, right? It's going to be
exactly. But every time I do not do that, there is a tiny bit of a negative externality generated to the world, right?
Yeah.
And this is the tragedy of commons problem, right? If you think about it, right? Because we are all sharing a space, the space of ideas. In some ideas, I decided to speak. In some ideas, I don't decide to speak. I don't decide to put it out there in that space of ideas. And every time I decide not to put an idea in the space of ideas, I'm essentially creating some form of negative externality. To you, for sure, because you and I are the only one talking. Let's say that we're not recording this conversation. You and I would be the only one talking, and you will be the only one that you never tapped into that new caveat or word to add, but I didn't add, right?
Yes.
And of course, the problem is that next time, if I were to add that caveat, next time you would speak about that point. If you thought that caveat was meaningful, you would add that caveat to another person. But now, because you never saw the caveat that I was going to add, but I didn't, you don't talk about that caveat to the next person. And that tiny negative externality adds up. Because it's not only in any pairwise conversation like you and I are having, but in many other conversations. If you get a third person, that is even worse, right? Because now not only you do not hear my caveat, but a third person did not hear their caveat. So whenever they are going to regurgitate your point, they don't add that caveat versus counterfactual they would have if I added that caveat. So all those things are actually happening and they add up and they become, I think, very consequential.
I guess part of it is just about the efficiency of communication, right? And how hard communication is. And then part of it is like, I don't know, like how to make some of these things low stakes, right? Like how can you so let's assume that we could communicate perfectly efficiently and like we didn't have to worry about got to stop the conversation and I'm going to have to make a point that, like Greg, you're like 90% of the way there, but there's this 10% I kind of want to hit you with that. But did you think about this? Or I kind of had this experience or I think about it this way. let's assume that you don't have to worry about like stopping the conversation, losing social capital, whatever you want to call it. We can do that. Still, I think there's the issue of, maybe it's partially tied to social capital, but this issue of like how to do it in a way that's low stakes, in the sense of like communicating that this is like 10% or something like that. And in a way where it's, maybe the low stakes that I want to communicate is that, it's not like an attack on someone's identity, or it's also just, it's kind of an invitation to think about something a little bit differently. Like, hey, I've had this experience. I think about it this way. Not saying you're wrong, not saying I'm right. Just here's a different perspective on things.
Yeah, I think it speaks a lot about objective truths versus subjective truths. Let me be more precise about what I mean about this. So think for instance about Wikipedia. So we have a situation where any person can go there in Wikipedia and edit something.
Yeah.
And of course, one might be afraid that if I know only about soccer, I'm going to go there and edit things about football. But in reality, this is so rare that what actually happens is that the kinds of people that want to edit, they tend to want to edit the things that they happen to know more about. And the kind of person that edits my edits would in turn know more about what they know about and so on. And they would not, like, for instance, if I go about saying something that I happen to know a lot, but I overdo it and I kind of make one more statement, which might be an exaggeration, as long as there's enough critical mass of people reading that page, you will see that somebody else will go and see my exaggeration, because that person might be an actual expert about that exact thing that I exaggerated on, and they're going to go and be more likely to edit that part. And if you take this feedback loop enough times, where there's enough error correction like that, you will find what typically we find in Wikipedia, which is something often much more correct than, say, Encyclopedia Britannica, which is written by professors like us.
Yeah.
But one problem with Wikipedia compared to Encyclopedia Britannica is that it's too long. It adds stuff, but it does not know how to see what is important. Because if you think about the notion of what is important and what is not important, that becomes more subjective. So to find whether something is true or not is often much easier than to find whether something is important or not. Wikipedia flattens the field, right? It flattens the field as in it puts every fact out there, but it doesn't necessarily take out things that are less relevant. In part because we don't have this police, this overarching monopoly of who actually decides what is important, what is less important.
Well, so I want to ask you, when you say the word important, do you mean interesting? Because I'm thinking about, in the back of my mind as we're speaking, I'm thinking a little bit about, okay, let's imagine that we start the optimal algorithm on some channel or some website or whatever. I mean, there's got to be something about salience and interestingness and novelty. It's got to get people's attention, right? And part of that is like, well, then you can just be the person shouting the loudest and the most outrageous, and like that's kind of where we are now. But it could also be most interesting in some, or important in some other, maybe more nuanced way. What would that be? Like, is it interesting in the sense that it helps you understand what's going on in the world? Or, what are the taste buds, or what's the palate to which that's going to like really, hit? I think, okay, so that's one thing. And then the other reaction I have to what you just said is, I think there's also this question though of thinking about the wisdom or the misjudgment of crowds, and thinking about, for example, consensus. Because I think, when you think about like the studies of juries and this kind of thing, where it's like having a consensus doesn't necessarily mean that you are correct. And it's funny because with the summer camps I helped to run, I actually think this is a huge issue that we're kind of coming across, and something that you've discussed in one of your other videos, is this issue of, how do you have collaboration with people? How can you find a way to work together when you don't have a consensus? What happens if, like, we don't agree on everything? Or, hey, we're like, clearly we can't agree on everything in some sense, right? Okay, we're still going to have to figure out a way to work together, right? And I think the question is like, yeah, how do you find those? How do you resolve the lack of consensus? And I don't know, should we still be trying to get to consensus? Probably. I don't know. How do you think about that issue of, in this case, we're talking about aggregating kind of information, right? Or beliefs or views, but you could also think about aggregating, preferences, or, and I guess the question is, how do you think about aggregating those when we know that, yeah, there's lots of ways in which we can be mistaken, like, collectively, right?
Yeah, I know what you mean. This is the issue, right? It's just very hard to aggregate preferences like that and constraints like that. But you do see some attempts to solve problems like that in practice. For instance, you see companies, I know Amazon, for instance, have ideas like disagree and commit, right? Like, you're my boss and I have an idea which you disagree, but there's something in you that thinks, maybe Greg has a little bit more information about this, or maybe let's go with what Greg says.
Yeah.
And then you would say something along the lines of disagree and commit, as in you will commit to what I'm saying, but you disagree.
Yeah.
And then, yes, I take the responsibility of, I guess, success and failure about this, but also you will not boycott me, right? You will help me. You are entering my axiom and you're trying to help me deliver that product through my idea. So you commit to this idea. So I guess that is, in practice, perhaps a useful possibility for some situations. The issue for me is, I really believe that there is no clear-cut solution to the issue of what is important, what is not important there, right? I think people mix up a lot of the concept of truth and objective truth, and there are certain truths that are just not objective. Like, for instance, I can tell you how much I love my wife, and you, because you love your wife, you have perhaps a good model about that, about how I love my wife, but you cannot see the exact quality and nature and even texture of the kind of love that I have for my wife, right? So, and it could be different from yours. Probably, in terms of course, I could be lying to you that I love my wife and you would not know, right? You cannot falsify my statement.
Yeah.
And that is the truth. Like, whatever I do here, which is whether I love my wife or not love my wife, that is some form of truth. And you really cannot perceive it with the same quality of the instrument that I can perceive it.
Well, then, is that entirely driven by subjective experience?
I do not know the answer to this question, but I do agree that one major concern here is the monopoly of the instrument, right? Of observation. Like, for instance, you and I can talk about things like, oh, you see the Statue of Liberty just behind you? Because I can point to it and you can see it by yourself with your instrument. But there are certain things that I cannot show to you that I perceive. And part of the problem is that, on the one hand, I could be lying to you. I could be, for one case, the person a charlatan, right? And I can say, oh, I saw God or something like that, when in reality, I may not have seen it. I'm just lying to you. But then you will have to believe me or not, taking my word for it, because you have no way of falsifying my statements. And of course, there are many experiences, still subjective experiences, that are sufficiently common, like a thought, or like the experience of love or grief, things like that. They're all subjective experiences that I cannot prove to you that I have them.
Yeah.
But you have a very good model that probably those things must be true. because you have them too yourself.
Yeah.
It's possible, it's not probable, but it's possible that you are the only person on planet Earth that has a thought. And you extrapolate and think, oh, Greg must have a thought too. But everybody around you are lying to, like in the Truman Show, right?
Yeah.
Of course, it's unlikely, but the key point here is that that's the limit. The moment your understanding of something is true only if it can be falsifiable, the moment you define truth like that, then you are necessarily restricting yourself to what we call objective truth, because it has to be a certain kind of truth that scales across different instruments of observation. Otherwise, it cannot be falsifiable. Otherwise, it cannot be replicable.
Yeah.
The problem about that is that you are essentially taking out a lot of things that we all understand to be true.
Yeah.
These are the limits of the search for truth in the way we currently understand in academia, we currently understand science. And that is a problem, right? Because the way we can build consensus is exactly by doing this error correction. Let's say that I see something that I think is like an extraterrestrial, but I was the only one seeing it, right? There was nobody around me at night. I was alone doing that. You really, for this person could be an extraterrestrial, and I could be right, or it could be something completely different. And let's say that maybe you and I see the exact same thing, but I'm in the one side of the forest, you are in the other side of the forest. You go about and you tell me, I saw in a helicopter or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And then you and I saw the exact same thing, except that I'm describing one way, you're describing another way. And if I try to describe what you saw in my words, you think, oh, Greg, that's not what I saw.
Yeah.
And if you try to describe in your words, I say, no, that is not what I saw. Right? So, and that is a problem here, because then there's never a possibility for you and I to build a more precise language of what we actually saw.
Yeah.
Because you cannot falsify my statement. I cannot falsify your statement, because it's possible that our statements are both correct because you and I saw different things. And I am afraid that by using your word, you will be flatten my experience. And you are afraid that if I use my words, it will flatten your experience. So the issue is that we cannot scale up, but it also means that you and I will have no opportunity to build consensus around this subjective experience and figure out what is the more precise language of what we both saw.
I'll make two quick comments. I'll say that, I mean, and it kind of goes both ways though, too, right? When you think about even trusting your own experience, right? Because in some sense, I mean, my understanding of neuroscience right now is that we're kind of hallucinating our reality all the time, right? Like it's all just kind of created in our mind. And so I think there's something about subjective experience too, which is a little bit unsettling in the sense of like, I don't know, can you trust your own experiences? And when do you have to be careful about that? And I'll say the other thing that, you know, your points are reminding me of, have you seen the movie Contact?
Yeah.
You know, there's a book by Carl Sagan. They made it into a movie, and it really hits at this theme of this issue of kind of the boundary of, you know, kind of what kinds of beliefs are based on science or objective verification, and what just has to always be subjective in some sense.
That part in the movie where Judy Foster, towards the end, says, I really had this experience. I have no way of corroborating and convincing you that this is true, but like in all my perception as a human being, I really felt like I had the experience. I thought that part was really well done, because it kind of convey very much what we are talking about here. I think this will be for another conversation, but I think part of the problem that we're discussing here is that it looks like we're talking about only subjective experiences. But here's my claim. I think every time we're trying to understand something, nuanced, think about your research, right? All your original ideas that made a paper. There was a moment where you were the only one person, or you and your co-authors were the only people that knew that idea.
Yeah.
And now you're trying to convey to people that idea.
Yeah.
That gap between your information set and everyone's information set, that gap right there is going to be first perceived as a subjective experience, if you think about it, right?
Yeah.
That gap.
Yeah.
And now you have to figure out how to build a pathway for everybody else to understand the logic in which you arrived at that conclusion. And of course, we are in the business of building science inside the axioms of science. So
Yeah.
our ideas that we put in publications are ideas where we can build that pathway, right?
Exactly.
We actually can.
Yes. Yes.
But that does not mean there are no other ideas out there that you also have like that. And the pathways are more murky.
Yeah. I
You
think
cannot
that's exactly right.
the exact axioms of science to build those paths. And I think we can discuss about this in the future, but I really believe that this is a fundamental limit of our search for the truth with the current tools that we have in science. I think also science is very adaptable and very capable of building new sets of actions, building certain tools and ways to go after that. So I'm very optimistic that we can build a new kind of science, right? That would allow us to tap into those other kinds of truths. But right now, our academia, our publication systems, our peer-reviewed systems, they are not meant for ideas like that to emerge at all.
Yeah.
And that is actually part of the reason why I came up with this YouTube channel, because I think some ideas need to be out there, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And I have no
avenue.
convey those ideas. Yeah.
Greg, I love it as always. As always.
It's true, man.
Just enjoyable, man. It's funny to think that this might be production and not just consumption, because it feels, it's good, man. It's good.